Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In this intense episode, Ekundayo ventures into the heart of a shadow-infested forest, determined to save a missing boy. What he finds there will test his resolve and force him to confront the growing darkness inside him. As he struggles to protect his village, the shadows grip tightens, sowing seeds of fear and suspicion among the villagers. But the shadow isn't Ekundayo's only challenge. Betrayal brews within the very people he's vowed to protect, and he must decide whether to fight or flee. With the forest spirits watching and the darkness whispering his deepest fears, Ekundayo's journey plunges into a world where alliances falter, the shadow looms larger, and the true battle for his soul begins. Will he withstand the shadow's relentless onslaught, or will the darkness finally consume him? As night fell, Ekundayo ventured into the forest, the familiar darkness closing in around him. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting into ominous shapes that reached out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the whispers of the shadows grew louder with every step he took. He called out the boy's name, his voice echoing through the eerie silence. But there was no response, only the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Ekundayo could feel the shadow within him stirring, excited by the proximity to the forest's darkness. It was as if the shadows in the forest were calling to the one inside him, drawing him deeper into their grasp. Suddenly, he heard a faint cry for help. It was distant, almost swallowed by the forest's gloom, but unmistakable. Ekundayo broke into a run, following the sound. His heart pounded in his chest as the cry grew louder, more desperate. He pushed through the thick underbrush, the branches scratching at his skin, until he reached a small clearing. There, in the center, was the boy, huddled and trembling, surrounded by swirling shadows that seemed to rise from the ground like mist. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, and he was trapped in a circle of darkness that pulsed with malevolent energy. "Stay back," the boy cried, his voice shaking. "They won't let me leave." Ekundayo stepped forward cautiously. He could feel the shadow inside him resonating with the dark energy in the clearing. The two forces were connected, feeding off each other's strength. "Hold on," Ekundayo said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to get you out of here." But as he approached the boy, the shadows reacted violently, lashing out at him with tendrils of darkness. They wrapped around Ekundayo's arms and legs, pulling him toward the center of the clearing. The darkness was cold, suffocating, and it filled his mind with whispers of despair and defeat. "You cannot save him," the shadows hissed. "You cannot even save yourself." Ekundayo gritted his teeth, fighting against the pull of the shadows. He could feel them trying to drag him down, to consume him, but he refused to give in. The power of the shadows within him surged, and he channeled it into a burst of energy that pushed the tendrils away. The boy watched in awe as Ekundayo stood his ground, his body glowing with a faint, dark light. The shadows recoiled, hissing angrily, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to swirl faster, forming a vortex of darkness that threatened to engulf them both. "Run!" Ekundayo shouted to the boy. "Run back to the village." The boy hesitated, fear paralyzing him, but Ekundayo's voice snapped him out of it. He scrambled to his feet and darted toward the edge of the clearing, the shadows parting just enough to let him through. But as the boy escaped, the vortex of shadows closed in on Ekundayo, wrapping around him like a cocoon. The darkness pressed in from all sides, squeezing the breath from his lungs and filling his mind with nightmares. He could feel the shadow within him merging with the vortex, feeding on his fear and despair. For a moment, Ekundayo felt himself slipping away, lost in the darkness. But then he remembered the promise he had made, to protect the village, to protect those he loved. He couldn't let the shadows win. He had to find the strength to fight back. With a final, desperate effort, Ekundayo summoned all the power within him and unleashed it in a burst of energy. The vortex exploded outward, the shadows disintegrating into wisps of smoke that faded into the night. Ekundayo fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The clearing was silent now, the darkness retreating. But he knew this was only the beginning. The shadows were growing stronger, and their influence was spreading. He had saved the boy, but the real battle was still to come. Ekundayo returned to the village with the boy safely in tow. The villagers were relieved to see him, but their fear of Ekundayo had not diminished. They whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with uncertainty and suspicion. Baba Adisa approached Ekundayo as he escorted the boy back to his family. "You saved him," the elder said, his voice laced with concern. "But I sense that the darkness has not been defeated." Ekundayo nodded grimly. "The shadows are growing stronger. They tried to take the boy, and I fear they will try again. Their influence is spreading, and I don't know how much longer I can keep them at bay." Baba Adisa's expression darkened. "The shadow inside you is connected to the shadows in the forest. They are one and the same, feeding off each other. If we do not find a way to break this connection, the entire village could be consumed." Ekundayo felt a pang of guilt. He had brought this darkness upon them, and now it was threatening to destroy everything he had fought to protect. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "How do I stop it?" The elder sighed, his gaze distant. "There may be a way, but it is dangerous. The shadow is a spirit bound to this world by ancient magic. To break its hold, you must find the source of its power and sever the connection. But doing so will put you in great danger. The shadow will not let go easily." Ekundayo knew the elder was right. The shadow had already shown its strength, and it would fight to maintain its grip on him and the village. But he also knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. If there was a way to stop the darkness, he had to try. "Tell me what I need to do," Ekundayo said, determination hardening his voice. Baba Adisa nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "There is an ancient shrine deep within the forest, the place where the boundary between our world and the spirit world is thin. The shadow's power is drawn from that place. You must go there and confront it, but you will not be alone. The spirits of the forest will be watching, and they may help you if they see fit." Ekundayo felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The shrine was a place of great power, a place where few dared to venture. The spirits there were unpredictable, and their intentions were not always clear. But he had no other choice. The fate of the village depended on him. "I will go," Ekundayo said firmly. "I will face the shadow and end this." Baba Adisa placed a hand on Ekundayo's shoulder, his grip firm. "May the spirits guide you, Ekundayo. And remember, you are stronger than the darkness. Do not let it consume you." Ekundayo took a deep breath, nodding to the elder. He knew the path ahead would be perilous, but he also understood that this was the only way to save his village. The darkness was spreading, and the shadow's influence was growing stronger each day. He couldn't allow it to consume the people he loved. That night, as the village slept, Ekundayo prepared for his journey. He gathered a small pack of essentials, water, food, and a ceremonial dagger that Baba Adisa had given him. The dagger was said to be imbued with protective magic, a relic from the old days when the village's ancestors had fought off evil spirits. As he walked through the village, Ekundayo felt the weight of his decision. The villagers were counting on him, even if they didn't fully trust him. He could feel their fear, their uncertainty, and it only strengthened his resolve. He had to end this, once and for all. The forest was dark and foreboding as Ekundayo stepped into its depths. The trees loomed high above, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal animals. But there was something else, too, a presence that seemed to follow Ekundayo's every move. It was the shadow, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ekundayo could feel it, the cold, oppressive force that clung to him like a second skin. He walked for what felt like hours, the path ahead growing narrower and more treacherous. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes that whispered dark secrets in a language he couldn't understand. The farther he went, the more he felt the shadow's influence growing stronger. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ekundayo reached the shrine. It was an ancient structure, half buried in the earth and covered in moss and vines. The stones were weathered and cracked, and the air around it crackled with a strange energy. This was the place Baba Adisa had spoken of, the heart of the shadow's power. Ekundayo approached the shrine cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the shadow pressing in on him, trying to overwhelm him with fear and doubt. But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. As he stepped onto the threshold of the shrine, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting like a living thing. The shrine's stones glowed with an eerie light, and Ekundayo could hear the whispers of the spirits growing louder. The shadow was here, and it was angry. The moment Ekundayo stepped into the shrine, the shadows surged toward him, their darkness swallowing the light from the stones. The air around him grew cold, almost freezing, and the whispers of the spirits turned into a cacophony of voices, all screaming in his mind. The pressure was immense, and for a moment, Ekundayo felt as if he were drowning in the shadow's power. "You dare to challenge me," the shadow's voice echoed through the shrine, deep and filled with malice. "You are nothing but a vessel, a pawn in a game far beyond your understanding. You cannot defeat me." But Ekundayo refused to back down. He knew the shadow was trying to intimidate him, to break his spirit. He gripped the ceremonial dagger tightly, its cold metal giving him a small measure of comfort. The dagger's magic was faint, but it was enough to push back against the overwhelming darkness. "I will not let you destroy my village," Ekundayo shouted, his voice shaking but firm. "I will end this, no matter the cost." The shadow laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Ekundayo's spine. "You think you can defeat me with a mere trinket? You are a fool." With those words, the shadow attacked. It came at Ekundayo from all sides, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. Ekundayo raised the dagger, its blade glowing faintly as it met the shadow's onslaught. The two forces clashed, and for a moment, it seemed as if the shrine itself would collapse under the weight of their battle. But the shadow was relentless. It pushed harder, trying to overwhelm Ekundayo with its sheer power. The darkness pressed in on him, suffocating him, filling his mind with despair. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, telling him to give up, to surrender to the inevitable. Ekundayo's strength was fading. He could feel the shadow's influence growing stronger, its darkness seeping into his very soul. His grip on the dagger weakened, and he fell to his knees, the weight of the shadow's power pressing down on him. "Give in, Ekundayo," the shadow whispered, its voice soft and seductive. "You cannot win. The darkness is your destiny." But just as Ekundayo felt himself slipping away, he remembered his mother's voice, her words of encouragement. He remembered the villagers who were counting on him, the little girl who had looked up to him with hope in her eyes. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the shadow win. With a final burst of strength, Ekundayo pushed back against the darkness. He raised the dagger high, its blade glowing brighter than ever before. The light cut through the shadow, slicing through its darkness like a knife through cloth. The shadow screamed in fury, its form twisting and writhing as it fought to maintain its hold on him. But Ekundayo didn't stop. He drove the dagger into the ground, its magic spreading through the shrine like wildfire. The stones glowed brighter, and the shadows recoiled, their power waning. The spirits that had once whispered despair now chanted in unison, their voices a powerful force that pushed the shadow back. The shrine shook, the ground splitting open as the shadow's power was broken. The darkness that had consumed the shrine dissipated, fading into the night. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted from Ekundayo's shoulders. The shadow was gone. Or so it seemed. For a moment Ekundayo allowed himself to believe that it was over, that the shadow had been defeated. The shrine was quiet now, the stones no longer glowing, and the air was still. He could hear the distant sounds of the forest, the chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the shadow had never existed. But deep down, Ekundayo knew better. The shadow's presence still lingered in his mind, a dark whisper that refused to be silenced. It was weaker now, its power diminished, but it was still there, waiting, watching. He stood up slowly, his body aching from the battle. The dagger in his hand was cold and lifeless, its magic spent. He looked around the shrine, searching for any sign of the shadow's return, but the darkness had retreated. For now. Ekundayo turned and began the long walk back to the village, his thoughts heavy. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The shadow's influence was still strong, and he knew it would come back, stronger than before. And when it did, he would have to be ready. As he walked through the forest, the path seemed longer than before, the trees taller and more ominous. The shadows danced around him, taunting him with their whispers. "You cannot escape us," they seemed to say. "We are part of you now." Ekundayo tried to ignore them, but the fear gnawed at him. What if the shadow was right? What if he couldn't escape its influence? What if the darkness was his destiny, just as the shadow had claimed? When he finally reached the village, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light over the huts. The villagers were already stirring, beginning their daily routines, but when they saw Ekundayo, they stopped and stared. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. They didn't know what had happened in the forest, but they could sense the darkness that still clung to him. They kept their distance, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to do. Baba Adisa approached him, his expression unreadable. "Did you succeed?" the elder asked quietly. Ekundayo nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The weight of his false victory was too much to bear. The elder placed a hand on Ekundayo's shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. "The shadow is still with you, isn't it?" Ekundayo looked down at the ground, unable to meet the elder's gaze. "I thought I defeated it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's still there. I can feel it." Baba Adisa sighed, his expression one of deep sadness. "The shadow's power is ancient, older than any of us. It cannot be defeated so easily. But you have weakened it, and that is a victory in itself." Ekundayo shook his head, the despair creeping back into his mind. "But it's not enough. The shadow is still there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I can't let my guard down, not for a moment." Baba Adisa's face hardened with resolve. "You've done more than any of us could have asked, Ekundayo. But you're right, the shadow is not defeated. Its influence lingers, and it will continue to test you, to push you to your limits. You must remain vigilant." As Ekundayo walked back to his hut, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadow might have been weakened, but he knew it was far from gone. The thought filled him with dread. How long could he continue to fight it off? And what if he failed? That night, Ekundayo lay awake, unable to sleep. The shadow's whispers grew louder in his mind, filling him with doubt and fear. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness, waiting for him to weaken. Then, in the dead of night, something happened that made Ekundayo's blood run cold. A scream, piercing and filled with terror, echoed through the village. Ekundayo bolted upright, his heart racing. He recognized that voice, it was his mother's. He rushed out of his heart pounding with fear. The village was in chaos, people were running, shouting, searching for the source of the scream. But Ekundayo knew exactly where it had come from. He reached his mother's hut, bursting through the door. The sight that greeted him was something out of a nightmare. His mother, Akanni, was on the ground, her body twisted in pain. Her eyes were wide with terror, staring at something unseen. And standing over her was a shadowy figure, a twisted, grotesque version of Ekundayo himself, formed entirely from darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and it grinned at him, a cruel, mocking smile. "No," Ekundayo whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't be happening." The shadowy figure laughed, the sound that echoed through the hut like nails on a chalkboard. "You thought you could contain me? Foolish boy. I am a part of you now. You cannot escape me." Ekundayo's mind raced. He knew this wasn't real, it was the shadow, manifesting itself in his darkest fears. But knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. Akanni groaned, her eyes pleading with Ekundayo. "Help me, my son," she whispered, her voice weak. The shadowy figure stepped closer to Akanni, its form shifting and writhing like a living nightmare. "What will you do, Ekundayo? Will you save your mother? Or will you let her suffer?" Ekundayo felt a surge of anger and fear. This wasn't just a test, it was a trap designed to break him. But he couldn't let it. He had to save his mother, no matter what. With a cry of determination, Ekundayo rushed at the shadowy figure, the ceremonial dagger in hand. The figure turned to face him, its red eyes gleaming with malice. But just as Ekundayo was about to strike, the shadow vanished, dissolving into a cloud of darkness. The hut fell silent, and Ekundayo stood over his mother, panting and shaking. Akanni's breathing was shallow, her eyes glazed with fear and pain. But she was alive. "Mother, I'm here," Ekundayo whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. "You're safe now." Akanni looked at him, her expression filled with both love and fear. "Ekundayo, what have you become?" she asked, her voice trembling. The words cut through Ekundayo like a knife. He realized then that the shadow wasn't just trying to destroy him, it was trying to turn the people he loved against him. And if he didn't find a way to stop it, it might succeed. The next morning, the village was quiet, tense. News of the attack on Akanni spread quickly, and the villagers were more frightened than ever. They whispered among themselves, their eyes constantly darting toward Ekundayo, filled with suspicion and fear. Ekundayo could feel their fear like a physical weight pressing down on him. He had saved his mother, but the shadow's influence was spreading faster than he could contain it. The villagers were starting to see him as the source of their troubles, rather than their protector. Baba Adisa called a meeting in the village square. The entire village gathered, the atmosphere thick with unease. The elder stood in the center, his expression grim. "We can no longer ignore the danger we face," Baba Adisa began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The shadow is not just a threat to Ekundayo, it is a threat to all of us. We must find a way to stop it before it consumes us all." One of the villagers, a man named Ade, stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "This all started when Ekundayo brought the shadow back with him," he said, his voice loud and accusatory. "He's the reason we are in danger. Maybe he's the one controlling it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Ekundayo felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his chest. He had expected suspicion, but not outright hostility. "I've done everything I can to protect this village," Ekundayo said, trying to keep his voice steady. The shadow is my responsibility, and I'm trying to stop it. Are you, another villager, a woman named Iriti, shouted. Or are you just pretending to fight it, while secretly bringing more darkness into our lives? The accusation stung, and Ekundayo felt the shadow within him stir, feeding off the fear and anger of the villagers. He had to fight to keep it under control, but it was growing harder by the moment. Baba Adisa raised his hands, calling for silence. Enough, he said firmly. This is not the time to turn against each other. We must remain united if we are to defeat this evil. But the damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and the villagers were beginning to question whether Ekundayo was truly on their side. After the meeting, Ekundayo retreated to his hut, his mind racing. The shadow's attack on his mother had been a calculated move designed to turn the village against him. And it was working. As night fell, Ekundayo sat alone in the darkness, his thoughts consumed by the shadow's whispers. It was winning, slowly but surely. The villagers were losing faith in him, and he could feel his own resolve beginning to crack. Then, as if in response to his growing despair, the shadow manifested in the corner of his hut. It was a twisted reflection of himself, its red eyes glowing with malevolent glee. You see now, don't you? The shadow whispered, its voice filled with cruel satisfaction. They will never trust you. You are an outsider, the danger to them. And soon, they will turn against you completely. Ekundayo clenched his fists, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. I won't let you win, he said through gritted teeth. I'll find a way to stop you. The shadow laughed, a dark, mocking sound. You are alone, Ekundayo. You have no allies, no one who believes in you. The more you fight, the stronger I become. Soon, you will be mine. With those words, the shadow vanished, leaving Ekundayo alone with his thoughts. The weight of the darkness was growing heavier, and for the first time, Ekundayo felt the true depth of his isolation. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the village grew more tense and hostile. The villagers avoided Ekundayo, their suspicion turning into outright fear. They whispered behind his back, their eyes filled with mistrust, and Ekundayo could feel the distance between him and the people he had once called his friends growing wider. Baba Adisa remained supportive, but even the elders' influence was waning. The shadow's presence was too strong, its influence too pervasive. The villagers were afraid, and fear was a powerful force, one that the shadow was using to its advantage. One night, as Ekundayo lay in his hut, he heard voices outside. At first, he thought it was just another group of villagers gossiping, but then he realized the voices were hushed, conspiratorial. Curious, he crept to the door and listened. I don't care what Baba Adisa says, one voice whispered. It was Ade, the man who had accused Ekundayo during the village meeting. We can't just sit around and wait for that boy to destroy us. We need to do something. What are you suggesting? Another voice asked, nervous but intrigued. Ade's voice grew more confident. We take matters into our own hands. We drive him out of the village before he brings more darkness upon us. Ekundayo's heart sank. They were planning to get rid of him, to exile him from the only home he had ever known. He had expected suspicion, but this was a betrayal. I don't know, the second voice said, hesitating. What if he's telling the truth? What if he really is trying to protect us? Ade scoffed. Protect us? He's the reason the shadow is here in the first place. He's dangerous, and if we don't do something, we are all doomed. The second voice, though still hesitant, eventually agreed. But what about Baba Adisa? He won't allow this. Ade's tone hardened. Baba Adisa is old and blinded by his affection for that boy. We can't afford to wait for him to see reason. We'll do what needs to be done, tonight. Ekundayo's blood ran cold. They were planning to act immediately, and he was out of time. He couldn't confront them directly, it would only confirm their worst fears. He needed to escape, but where could he go? The forest was filled with dangers, and the shadow would follow him wherever he went. But staying in the village was no longer an option. If he stayed, he would be driven out, or worse. He had to leave, and quickly. Slipping back into his hut, Ekundayo grabbed the few belongings he could carry, his ceremonial dagger, a small pouch of food, and a cloak to keep him warm. He knew he couldn't take much, as he needed to move fast. Every moment he delayed increased the risk of being caught. As he prepared to leave, a thought struck him, his mother. He couldn't just leave without saying goodbye, without telling her why he had to go. But he also couldn't risk her getting involved in whatever the villagers were planning. If she tried to defend him, they might turn against her too. With a heavy heart, Ekundayo decided to leave a note. He found a scrap of parchment and quickly scrawled a message. "Mother, I must leave the village to protect you and everyone else. I promise I will find a way to defeat the shadow and return. Please, stay safe. I love you. Ekundayo." He placed the note where she would find it in the morning, and then, with one last look at the hut he had called home, Ekundayo slipped out into the night. The village was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Ekundayo moved quickly, staying in the shadows to avoid being seen. He knew the paths through the village well, and soon he was at the edge of the forest. As he entered the forest, the familiar sense of unease settled over him. The shadows seemed to welcome him, their whispers growing louder in his mind. But Ekundayo steeled himself against their influence. He had made his decision, and he wouldn't let the shadow win. The forest closed in around him as he ventured deeper, the trees forming a dark canopy overhead. The path ahead was unclear, but Ekundayo knew he had to keep moving. If he could find a safe place to hide, he could figure out his next move. But as he walked, the shadows grew bolder, their whispers turning into voices that echoed his darkest fears and doubts. "You cannot escape," the shadows taunted. "The village doesn't want you. They fear you. You are alone, abandoned." Ekundayo clenched his fists, fighting back against the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He had to stay strong, for his mother's sake, for the village's sake. He couldn't let the shadow win. But the darkness was relentless, and as Ekundayo pressed on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, followed. The shadows seemed to move with him, closing in from all sides. He knew the shadow itself was nearby, waiting for the moment he would falter. Suddenly, Ekundayo heard a rustling in the bushes behind him. He spun around, his dagger at the ready, but there was nothing there, just the wind rustling the leaves. But the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Realizing he couldn't stay in one place for long, Ekundayo resumed his journey, but his heart pounded in his chest. The shadow was playing with him, toying with his mind, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it made its move. Will the shadow succeed to drive Ekundayo crazy and this way lead him to his doom? You will find out in the next episode.